He controlled everything, every room, every deal, every person who walked through his door. For 30 years, Rafael Moro had never lost, never been outmaneuvered, never been caught off guard. And then, quietly, without anyone announcing it, he started getting sick. His hand trembled in meetings. He lost sentences mid-thought. 3 doctors found nothing. His closest people said it was stress. They said it was age. They said it was the cost of building an empire. What nobody said, what nobody dared to say, was the truth. Because the truth was happening right in front of them, in plain sight, every single day. And the only person who saw it was the woman nobody looked at. The woman who came to clean his house every morning at 6:20 for 12 years. Not a detective, not a spy, just a woman who paid attention when everyone else had stopped. What she found in that bathroom would change everything. And what she chose to do with it, that is the part that will stay with you. This channel is about the world of the mafia boss. Some people are born to lead. Some lessons the classroom will never teach you. Only the men who've held real power know them. We don't tell crime stories here. We tell stories about mindset, about character, about the secrets behind what power actually looks like when the cameras are off. If that is the world you want to understand, you are in the right place. This story carries one truth that most of us learn too late. The most dangerous threat in your life is not the enemy standing in front of you. It is the one standing beside you who stopped being honest and started being strategic. And the person who saves you is almost never the one you expected. It is the one you stopped seeing, the one you walked past every day without asking their name. If this story speaks to something real in you, leave a comment below. Tell me when you realized someone had been managing you instead of being honest with you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories that make you think differently about power, loyalty, and what it actually takes to survive at the top. I will see you in the next one. In the next.
Rafael Moro was a man who never got sick. Not because he had exceptional health, not because he ate right or exercised or took care of himself the way doctors tell you to. He never got sick because he simply did not allow it. 20 years, not one day off for a fever, not one meeting canceled because of a headache, not one morning where he called someone and said, "I can't make it today." The men who worked around him read that as evidence of power, and in a way, it was. But power and will are two different things. Power can be inherited. Power can be bought. Will is something you burn through, a little at a time, until one day there is nothing left to burn. Raphael had been burning through his for a very long time. Monday morning, the estate on the outskirts of Boston. 5:30 in the morning, and the house was already half awake. The kitchen had light in it. The driveway was still dark. Raphael sat in his second-floor study with his dress shirt not fully buttoned, reading last week's import reports the way most people read the news. Familiar. Automatic. The numbers talked to him like a first language. He was 57 years old. Sicilian roots, raised in South Boston. 30 years building an empire that moved luxury goods across borders, vintage cars and rare wine and fine art and other things that didn't always make it onto the customs manifest. He wasn't the cold, stone-faced type you see in the movies. He ran warm. He laughed loud when something struck him as genuinely funny. He sang opera in the kitchen when he thought no one was listening. But all of that warmth was wrapped inside a layer of authority so thick and so practiced that the people around him rarely saw the actual human being underneath. The study smelled like coffee and old books. The walls were real stone. The floor was oak, worn smooth in the paths Raphael walked most often. The bookshelf ran the full length of one wall, filled with volumes that were actually read, not placed there for appearance. At 6:20, he heard the sound of a car on the driveway. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. That sound, the particular note of that engine, the way the tires rolled slow and careful over the gravel, That was Maria Santos arriving for work. Same time, every working day, for 12 years. His brain registered it the way it registered the sound of wind through the window glass. Background, not signal. He turned the page. Downstairs, Maria came through the side entrance the way she always did, setting her bag by the door, pulling on her apron, starting in the kitchen. She was 52 years old, born in Bogota, Colombia, and she had been cleaning this house since 2013. She arrived at 6:20 and left at 3 in the afternoon, and she never asked for anything beyond what she needed to do her work. People walked past her the way people walk past furniture. This was the thing almost nobody understood about people like Maria. Invisible does not mean blind. It means the opposite. When you are invisible, people forget you are in the room. They say things they would never say if they remembered you were there. They make phone calls. They have arguments. They lower their voice and then forget they lowered it. 12 years, every working day, Maria Santos had heard more than any officially employed member of Rafael Moro's organization. She simply had nowhere to put most of it. Mid-morning, Rafael was in a meeting with Dante Caruso and two others about a new shipment coming in from Palermo. Dante was 52, Rafael's closest friend since their 20s, the man who had been at his right hand for 3 decades. Smart, composed, loyal, by every appearance, with a kind of seamless perfection that might have looked suspicious if anyone had been paying that kind of attention. Rafael was talking about the timeline for the shipment, and then he stopped. Not a pause to think. A stop, like a record cut off mid-song. The sentence just wasn't there anymore. He looked down at the paper in front of him. His left hand, resting on the edge of the table, trembled slightly. Not a lot. Just enough. Everyone in the room saw it. Nobody said a word. Dante stepped in, easy and smooth, the way a man does when he's done it before. Said, "What Raphael means is the shipment needs to clear before the end of the month. That right?" Raphael looked at him. "That's right." The meeting continued, but something had changed in the room. Small, quiet, changed. Maria came into the study around 10 o'clock to clean, after everyone had cleared out. She worked in the same sequence she always did. Dust first, vacuum after, mop last. And while she worked, she noticed things. Raphael's coffee cup was still almost full. He always finished it. 3 papers were sitting at odd angles, not the way he usually stacked them. And on the edge of the desk, a faint smudge, the kind left by a palm pressed flat. She had seen that smudge before. She didn't say anything to anyone. She wiped the smudge away, straightened the papers, and moved on. That afternoon, working in the second-floor hallway, she caught a piece of conversation between Dante and someone she didn't recognize. 2 men who assumed they were alone. The words came low and fast. One man said, "How long before he has to step back?" The other said, 2 months, maybe 3. She didn't have the context. She kept moving. But the words stayed in her ear the way certain sounds do, the kind your brain holds onto without asking permission. And at the end of the day, as Raphael walked through the corridor, he passed close enough that she could see his face clearly. He was moving at normal speed, but he put his hand against the wall for just a second, as if the floor had tilted. Then he kept walking. He didn't know she saw. She didn't say anything. But that night, lying in bed in her small apartment in Dorchester, she thought about the coffee cup, the papers, the smudge on the desk, the hand against the wall. Small things, every one of them, the kind of things that, alone, mean nothing. She fell asleep wondering why they felt, lined up together like the beginning of something. There are things that start so slowly you don't realize you're losing them. Not the sudden kind of loss, not like missing a step in the dark. The gradual kind, like water dropping out of a glass, a little every day, until one morning you look and you can see the bottom. The first month, Raphael started leaving his coffee unfinished in the mornings. Small thing. Maria poured it out without remarking on it. The second month he ate less at lunch. Rosa, the cook who had fed this household for 20 years, got anxious the way Italian women do when the people they love stop eating. She made his favorites. He ate half. The third month, Maria found him asleep at his desk twice. Not an intentional rest, not a man who had decided to take a nap. The kind you fall into when you can no longer hold on. Books open in front of him, head bowed, breathing slow. She cleaned around him and didn't wake him. The fourth month, Raphael didn't come down to breakfast for the first time in 12 years. Dante ran the morning meeting in his place. The fifth month, 3 different doctors. Blood work, CT scan, full MRI. All of it came back clean. Possible early burnout, one of them said. Stress, overwork. Raphael heard the results the way he heard quarterly reports. He nodded once and thanked them, and that was the end of it. By month 6, the illness was no longer getting worse, but it was not getting better. It moved like weather, unpredictable, some days almost normal, other days like watching a man wrapped in fog. Dante was always there on the foggy days, always ready, always present. By month 8, which was now, the people in this house had adjusted. They had built their routines around the new Raphael, the one who sometimes lost a sentence in the middle of it, the one whose hand shook slightly in the mornings, the one who needed to rest in the afternoon the way he never had before. They had stopped treating it as a problem to be solved and started treating it as the way things were. That was the most dangerous thing of all. Not the illness itself, the acceptance. Maria watched the household shift the way you watch a river change course after a storm. Slowly, naturally, like it had always been going this way. Dante Caruso moved into the spaces Raphael left behind, not by force, not by announcement, but by simple presence. When Raphael wasn't sharp enough to decide, Dante decided. When Raphael wasn't available, Dante was. The phone calls started going to Dante first. She saw it every day. She saw the way certain people would ask Raphael's opinion with full respect and then glance toward Dante afterward, checking whether the answer held. She knew that glance. She had seen it before, in a different place, a long time ago, before she came to this house. She had seen people look at her husband that way, near the end, when he was carrying something that was too heavy for him. She pushed that thought back down. Rosa was the person Maria talked to most in that kitchen, not because they had chosen each other, but because they occupied the same invisible layer of this house, and people like that tend to find one another. They didn't talk much, but what they said, they meant. One morning, Rosa was preparing the daily supplement, the bottle of vitamins and minerals that Raphael's doctor had recommended. She measured out the dose, stirred it into the fresh orange juice, set it on the tray. "Running low again," Rosa said, not really to anyone. Maria asked, "Is he taking more than the dose?" Rosa said, "No, same every day, but the bottle goes faster than I'd expect." The 2 women looked at each other across the kitchen. Neither said anything more. But Maria's brain filed it next to the memory from the month before, when Rosa had asked if Maria had seen where the vitamin C bottle had gone, because it had been swapped out for a new one before the old one was finished. 2 bottles, running fast. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she did not forget it. That afternoon, she watched Raphael from outside the window while she polished the garden-facing glass. He was sitting alone in the backyard, in the chair by the oak tree, holding a glass of lemonade, and looking at nothing in particular. Not reading, not on the phone, just sitting. She watched longer than she should have, and for the first time in 12 years, she didn't see the boss. She saw a man who was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, more gray in his hair than a year ago, shoulders that had started to carry something they hadn't been asked to carry before. For just a second, one she didn't want and couldn't stop, she thought of Edward. Her husband had looked exactly like that near the end. That specific kind of tired. The kind that means something is wrong, but the person hasn't said it yet. Maybe doesn't know it themselves. She turned back to the glass. Kept polishing. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was reading into things, projecting old grief onto a new situation. She told herself that Rafael Moro was not her concern. But the bottles still ran fast, and the smudge on the desk kept coming back. And the memory of those two men in the hallway, their low voices, the words 2 months, maybe 3, that memory sat in her like a stone in still water, sinking slowly, going nowhere. In every large house, the kitchen is the real center. Not the boardroom, not the office with the locked door. The kitchen, where people eat and stand around with their coffee before the day starts and sit at the end of the afternoon when the formal hours are over. People say things in kitchens they don't say in other rooms. Maria Santos had known that for a long time. 12 years in this house had only made her more certain of it. Rosa De Luca had been cooking for Rafael for 20 years. She was 60 years old, square-shouldered, practical, the kind of woman who expressed love through food and expected you to understand that was what she was doing. She had watched Rafael grow from a young man in his late 30s into the person he was now, and she felt about him the way a person feels about family, which meant she worried about him the way family worries, constantly and without being asked. On a Tuesday morning in late October, Maria arrived to find Rosa already standing at the counter with the supplement bottle in her hand, frowning at it. Maria said, "Something wrong?" Rosa said, "I don't understand this. I measure out the same amount every day, same as always, but we go through this faster than we should." She set the bottle down and turned back to the stove, and that was the end of the conversation for her. Just a thing she'd noticed. Not a concern, just a fact. But Maria stood there a moment longer than necessary, looking at the bottle. There was a small, transparent panel on the side that let you see how many capsules remained. She had looked at that bottle many times. She had looked at it this morning when she passed the counter. And something about it, something she couldn't name, had made her stop. She moved on, finished her rounds, came back through the kitchen at lunch. The bottle was gone. Rosa had put it back in the cabinet. That evening, Maria stayed 15 minutes later than usual. She told Rosa she had forgotten to clean the bathroom baseboard. She went upstairs, went to the private bathroom, and stood in front of the cabinet with the light on. She took the bottle down, held it, opened it. She reached inside and carefully removed one capsule and set it on her palm. The capsule was pale blue, the correct color, the correct size, but at one edge, so faint you would miss it without good light and a reason to look, there was a hairline seam. The casing had been opened and resealed, not cracked, opened deliberately, with precision and the right tools, and put back together so carefully that a person going through normal motions would never catch it. She held it up toward the light. The inside was not uniform. One half was a white powder, consistent with what should be in there. The other half was a powder that was slightly, unmistakably, more yellow. Maria put the capsule back, replaced the bottle exactly as she had found it, walked downstairs, said goodnight to Rosa, got in her car. She drove 3 blocks before she had to pull over. She sat in the car with her hands on the steering wheel and her engine running, and she thought about what she had just seen. Not what it might mean, what it definitely meant. She had spent enough years around careful people to know the difference between coincidence and intention. Someone had opened those capsules. Someone had replaced part of what was inside with something else. Someone had done this carefully enough that it looked like nothing from the outside. And someone had been doing it long enough that a man who had never been sick in his life was now losing sentences in the middle of meetings and pressing his hand against walls to stay upright. Rafael Moro was not sick. He was being poisoned. She drove home. She did not sleep. The next morning, she arrived at the normal time and worked her normal hours and spoke to no one about what she knew. Because the first question she had to answer was not what was happening. She already knew what was happening. The question was who, and the question after that was what she was going to do about it. She thought about her husband. Edward Santos had been dead for 15 years. He had died in a car accident on the highway outside Boston, ruled driver error, no witnesses. She had never believed it. Edward was the most careful driver she had ever known. He had never so much as gotten a speeding ticket. He was meticulous and measured, and he paid attention to everything. He had also been an accountant for a small logistics company that had recently started working with Rafael Moro's network. And 3 weeks before he died, he had come home distracted. Quieter than usual. She had asked him what was wrong, and he had said, "Nothing. I just found something in the books that doesn't make sense." She had said, "What kind of something?" He had said, "I don't know yet." He never got the chance to find out. She had come to this house looking for the man she blamed for that. She hadn't been entirely wrong to look. But 12 years of watching a real person, not a rumor, not a name attached to a story, had complicated everything she thought she knew. Rafael Moro was not the man she had built in her head. He was harder to explain than that, but harder to explain didn't mean innocent. And the question of who had ordered what in 2009 was now tangled up with the question of who was slowly putting something into his supplements in 2024. She needed more before she moved. She began to pay a different kind of attention. She had always been observant. That was her nature, trained by years of necessity. But now she observed with purpose, with a specific question she was trying to answer. She watched who went near the bathroom when no one was supposed to be there. She watched timing, arrivals, and departures, who stayed too long in places they had no real reason to be. She went back through her memory and pulled up fragments of overheard conversations she had set aside without meaning to, names and numbers and half-sentences that had seemed like noise at the time. On the third day, she saw Dante Caruso go into Raphael's private bathroom. Not when he was visiting Raphael. Raphael was downstairs. Dante came up the back stairs alone, went into the bathroom, and came out 3 minutes later. No obvious reason. No object in his hands. Just 3 minutes, and then he was gone. She noted the time. She noted the day. She said nothing. On the 6th day, something Rosa mentioned clicked against something Maria already knew. Rosa had been confused a few weeks back about a bottle that had been replaced before it was empty. Someone had swapped it out early. Someone who had access to the bathroom, knew the layout of the cabinet, and had reason to handle the supplements. The list of people who fit that description was short. On the 9th day, emptying the office wastebasket, she found a small torn piece of paper with a chemical notation printed on it. The kind of shorthand you'd write if you were checking a compound against a formula. She photographed it with her phone before she dropped it in the bag. That evening, she went to the public library, not to her own computer. The library computer, a shared terminal in the reference section, anonymous, unhurried. She typed the notation into the search. The result came back in under a minute. A neurological inhibitor compound, used in low doses in certain prescribed medications. When introduced gradually into someone's system through a delivery vehicle they trusted, like a daily supplement, it could produce a specific set of symptoms. Fatigue that didn't respond to rest. Intermittent hand tremors. Cognitive fog that came and went unpredictably. Recurring headaches without identifiable cause. She sat in the library for a long time with that information on the screen in front of her. Then she closed the window, gathered her things, and drove home. She had her answer. Now she had to decide what to do with it. The hardest part was not knowing. Maria had lived with not knowing for 15 years. Not knowing what had happened to Edward. Not knowing whether she was right to blame the person she blamed. Not knowing whether working in this house was an act of justice or just grief walking in circles. 15 years of that specific uncertainty had taught her one thing. The not knowing is always harder than the truth. No matter how bad the truth is, it is easier to carry than the question. She had the answer now, and it was bad, and it was easier. On a Thursday morning, 12 days after she had first photographed that capsule under the bathroom light, Maria arrived at 6:20, same as always, and went upstairs before Rosa came in. She had done this twice before. This time she came back to confirm what she already knew. To hold the evidence one more time so she would be completely sure before she did anything with it. She opened the cabinet, took out the bottle, removed one capsule and held it to the light. Still there. the hairline seam, the two-colored powder inside. She replaced it, closed the cabinet, and then she stood in that bathroom for a moment, very still, looking at the bottles lined up neatly on the shelf, each one labeled, each one placed exactly where it should be. Someone had learned this bathroom the way you learn a room you spend time in. Someone had learned exactly how everything was arranged, and had arranged the wrong things carefully enough to look like the right things. She went downstairs and started her morning as if nothing had changed. But 2 hours later, Dante Caruso came upstairs again. She had positioned herself in the hallway with a dust cloth, giving herself a reason to be there, and she watched without watching as he went in and came back out. 3 minutes again. Exactly 3. She kept her face still. She kept moving. She said nothing. That afternoon, Rosa said something that unlocked the last piece. They were in the kitchen cleaning up after lunch when Rosa mentioned, casually, the way you mention things that are only half on your mind. Mr. Dante is so good about keeping track of the medical schedule. He even reminds me when to order more supplements before we run low. Maria said, "That's helpful." Rosa said, "It is. Dr. Walsh doesn't always catch those details. But Mr. Dante stays on top of everything." Maria said, "How long has he been doing that?" Rosa thought for a moment. "Oh, since the spring, I think. Around April." Raphael's symptoms had started in the spring. Maria thought about that for the rest of her shift. She thought about it on the drive home. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, and the photo of Edward on the shelf, and she thought about what she was going to do. She could not go to the police. She had worked in this household long enough to understand what that would mean. Even if the right officers took the right case, it would surface too slowly, too publicly, and the people with power in this situation would have time to move. She could not go to Rosa, who was loyal to Raphael but had no reach. She could not go to Luca, Raphael's adopted son, without knowing what Luca knew and where his loyalties actually sat. She could go to Dr. Walsh. She had an address for the doctor's office from 12 years of scheduling around medical appointments. But going to the doctor with a photographed capsule and a chemical search result was not the same as going with the kind of evidence a doctor would act on. She would need more, or she would need to go directly to the one person who could actually do something with what she had, Raphael himself. She turned that over in her mind for a long time. He was not a simple man. She had spent 12 years understanding that. He was powerful and complicated, and the world he moved through had rules that most people didn't know existed. Going to him with this meant trusting that he would act on what she told him rather than on the assumption that she was wrong, or lying, or working some angle she didn't have. And there was the other thing, the thing she had been carrying for 15 years. Because if Dante Caruso was responsible for what was happening to Raphael now, and if that same piece of paper from the waste bin meant what she was afraid it meant, then Dante Caruso had also closed the case on Edward, had made sure it stayed closed, which meant the accident that killed her husband was not an accident, which meant she had been right all along, just wrong about who. She picked up the photo of Edward from the shelf and looked at it. Bogota, 1997. The two of them in front of a building painted blue, laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. He had been 34. She had been 29. Neither of them had any idea what was coming. "I think I finally know," she said quietly, in Spanish. "I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but I know." She set the photo back down. She went to bed. In the morning she would decide. The morning came gray and cold, the way Boston mornings do in November, and Maria made her decision before she got out of bed. She was going to collect 2 more pieces of evidence, and then she was going to find a way to talk to Raphael alone. The first piece she already had, the photographs, the chemical search, her documented observations. The second piece she needed to look for. She had been working in this house for 12 years. She knew where the paper recycling was kept before it went to the bin outside. She knew which drawers held old correspondence that no one ever fully sorted. She knew the rhythm of who was in which room at which time of day. On Friday afternoon, with Dante away for an outside meeting and Luca working downtown, and Rosa focused on dinner prep. Maria went carefully through the recycling bin in the office. She found it on the third look, buried under printed emails and discarded drafts. A torn piece of paper, different from the chemical notation, printed in a small font, part of a longer document that had been shredded except for this one strip. The strip said, in clean typed letters, Santos matter closed per DC arrangements. Santos, her name, Edward's name. She stood in the office with that strip of paper in her hand and felt the floor go slightly soft beneath her. Not because it was a surprise, because it was a confirmation. And confirmations of the worst thing you suspected are their own particular kind of blow. DC was Dante Caruso, and the Santos matter, closed by his arrangements, was her husband. She photographed the strip. She put it back where she found it. She finished the afternoon. She said goodnight to Rosa and she drove home, and she did not fall apart. Not that night, because she had already decided that falling apart was for later. Right now there was something that needed to be done. On Monday morning, she was going to talk to Rafael Moro. The weekend was the longest Maria had spent in her own company in years. She did not call anyone. There was no one to call who would understand the full shape of what she was carrying. She cleaned her apartment, which was already clean. She cooked a meal she barely ate. She walked to the corner store Saturday morning and stood in the bread aisle for 3 minutes without picking anything up, then went home. She thought about courage, not the word, the thing. The actual experience of being afraid and doing something anyway. She had been afraid before. She had been afraid when she came to the United States with $200 and a work permit and didn't know anyone in Boston. She had been afraid the morning she drove to Edward's funeral and had to walk in and sit in the front row and hold herself together in front of people who kept saying how sorry they were. She had been afraid every single day for the first month she worked in this house, walking through those rooms, learning those faces, waiting to feel something that would tell her what she was supposed to do. Fear was familiar. She knew what to do with it. You breathe through it. You do the next thing. You don't wait for it to go away because it doesn't go away. You just stop asking it for permission. Monday morning, 6:20, she pulled into the driveway. She went inside, started her rounds, and waited for the right moment. It came in the early afternoon. Most Mondays, Raphael spent the late morning in back-to-back meetings and came outside around 2 o'clock to sit with his coffee before the dinner hour pulled everyone back indoors. It was one of the few habits he had kept through 8 months of illness. The garden, the chair by the oak tree, 20 minutes of nothing in particular. Maria brought a watering can. She had used this before. Legitimate tools for legitimate presence. The way you learn to move around powerful people without looking like you're approaching them with intention. She started with the flower beds on the far side. He was reading, or trying to. He had the book open, but his eyes weren't moving. After a few minutes, he put it down. He said, "How are you, Maria?" She said, "I'm well, sir. How are you feeling today?" He gave her the answer he gave everyone. Fine. She kept watering, let another minute pass. Then she set the can down and turned to face him. She said, "Sir, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you do anything." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not suspicion, attention, the real kind. He said, "Tell me." She told him. She started with the capsule, the hairline seam, the two-colored powder, the photograph she had taken on her phone. She told him about the chemical notation in the wastebasket, about the library computer, about what the compound was and what it did in low doses over time. She told him about Dante and the bathroom, the 3-minute visits with no apparent reason. She told him what Rosa had said about the ordering schedule, about Dante taking over the medical administration quietly, starting in April. She told him that the symptoms he had been experiencing for 8 months were consistent with exactly what this compound would do to a person who was taking it in small amounts every day without knowing. She said, "I have photographs of the capsule, sir. I have a photograph of the notation. I have dates and times I wrote down. I know this is not the kind of evidence you would take to a lawyer, but it's enough for you to verify independently." He did not interrupt her once. When she finished, there was a silence. Not the angry kind, the processing kind, the kind she recognized from watching him across 12 years of hard conversations she had only heard one side of. He said, "Why are you telling me this?" She said, "Because there is a second thing, and I don't know how to tell you the first without telling you the second." He said, "Go on." She said, "My husband's name was Edward Santos. He died in 2009. The official ruling was driver error. I never believed that. He was an accountant for a company that had recently started working within your network. He found something in the books he wasn't supposed to find. 3 weeks later, he was dead." Raphael's expression did not change, but his stillness changed, the quality of it. She said, "I don't know if you knew. I came to this house believing you did. 12 years changes how you see a person. I'm not certain anymore that the order came from you, but I found something in the office recycling 2 weeks ago." She took out her phone, showed him the photograph of the torn strip of paper. Santos matter closed per DC arrangements. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he said, "Edward Santos. I know that name. Not because I ordered anything, because someone brought me a report around that time. A small matter had been handled. That was the language. A small matter handled. The person who brought me that report was Dante." The words landed in the garden like stones in water. Quiet. Final. Maria said, "I thought so." Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Raphael said, "Leave this with me. Don't tell anyone what you've told me. Don't change anything about how you work. Don't look at him differently. Can you do that?" She said, "I've been doing it for 2 weeks already." He looked at her. Something crossed his face that she didn't have a simple word for. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated than that. He said, "I know." She drove home that afternoon feeling lighter than she had expected to feel. Not happy, not relieved, just lighter, the way you feel when you put down something heavy. The weight was still in the world, still in the situation, still in the reckoning that was coming. But it was no longer only hers to carry. She had done her part. The rest was his. And for the first time in 15 years, she thought she understood which man had actually taken Edward from her. And it was not the man she had spent 12 years watching through windows. She cooked dinner. She ate it. She slept a full 8 hours for the first time since October. Raphael did not act immediately. That was the thing that people who didn't know him would have gotten wrong. They would have expected the immediate reaction, the explosion, the swift and terrible consequence. That was the version in the stories, the boss who finds out and moves the same day, fast and hot and final. Raphael had learned a long time ago that men who acted on anger acted wrong. Not sometimes. Almost always. The heat of the moment is a terrible navigator. You go fast, but you go in whatever direction you happen to be facing when the feeling hits. And that is almost never the right direction. He sat in the garden after Maria went inside. He sat there for an hour. He thought about the past 8 months. He went through it the way you go through an account book, item by item, looking for where the numbers stopped adding up. Every time the doctor found nothing. Every time Dante happened to be present, helpful, smoothly available, in exactly the right position to step into the space that Raphael's illness was creating. Every meeting where Raphael had been slow and Dante had been fast. Every phone call that had started going to Dante first. It all added up now. It added up to something that made perfect, horrible sense. 30 years. 30 years he had trusted this man with everything, with knowledge that would put both of them away for the rest of their lives if it landed in the wrong hands, with access to his home, his schedule, his finances, his family. The kind of trust you build over decades, brick by brick, that feels as solid as the foundation of a house. And someone had been quietly removing bricks. He made one phone call that evening, not to Dante, not to Luca, to Dr. Patricia Walsh on her personal line, the number he had for emergencies only. He said, I need you to run a specific panel, not through the regular channels. I need complete discretion. I need results in 48 hours. She said, Raphael, what am I looking for? He said, toxicology, the detailed kind. Something that wouldn't show up on a standard workup because you wouldn't know to look for it. There was a pause. Then she said, I'll make the arrangements. Come in Wednesday morning, early before my first appointment. He said, Thank you. He hung up. He went to dinner. He sat at the table with Dante, who was pleasant and informative and funny in the way he had always been. And Raphael ate and listened and responded and gave nothing away. Because that was the other thing he had learned. When you know something the other person doesn't know, you hold that advantage for exactly as long as it takes to confirm your facts. Not a day longer, not a day less. Wednesday morning, the results came back. Dr. Walsh sat across from him in her office, no staff present, and she laid the report on the desk between them. She said, There is a compound in your bloodstream that has no business being there. A neurological inhibitor. Low dose but consistent. The kind of consistent that means it's been introduced regularly over a sustained period. He said, How long? She said, Based on the levels, at minimum 8 months, possibly longer. He said, What does it do? She said, At this dose, it doesn't kill. It diminishes. Fatigue that doesn't respond to rest. Intermittent tremors. Cognitive disruption that comes and goes. It's designed to look like stress, like burnout, like the normal wear of a man your age pushing himself too hard for too long. She paused. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the right dose to make you look sick without making you look poisoned. He said, Who would have access to do this? She said, Someone who could get to something you consume every day, consistently, reliably, without raising suspicion. He said, Thank you, Patricia. She said, Raphael, do you know who it is? He said, Yes. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and drove back to the estate. That evening, he found Luca. Luca Moro was 32 years old and not Raphael's son by blood, but by everything else. Raphael had taken him in at 12, after Luca's father, an old colleague, died young. Luca had grown up in this house, at this table, under this roof. He loved Raphael in the way only someone who was given a father they didn't expect can love that person. Completely. Without condition. With the kind of trust that hadn't yet been broken enough to learn how to hold something back. Raphael sat with him in the small office Luca used for his own work. He said, What have you noticed in the past 8 months? Things you didn't mention because you weren't sure what to make of them. Luca was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I noticed Dante was always ready, like always exactly ready. Whenever you weren't at full capacity, he was already in position. It felt like he knew where the gaps would be before they opened. Raphael said, What else? Luca said, He kept me busy. New projects, new responsibilities, things that pulled me in different directions. I think I was being managed. I didn't understand it that way at the time, but looking back, he stopped. Raphael said, Go on. Luca said, I think he was keeping me occupied so I wouldn't have time to notice what I might have noticed. Raphael looked at his son, this man who was not his blood, but who sat in front of him with the face of someone trying very hard to be honest about something uncomfortable. And he thought about what that kind of loyalty costs to maintain, and how rare it actually was. He said, I'm going to tell you something, and when I'm done, I need you to let me finish before you react. Luca said, Okay. He told him. He told him about the toxicology results. He told him about Maria, and the capsules, and the compound, and the 8 months, and the arrangement that had been running in this house right under all of their noses. He told him about Edward Santos, and the torn strip of paper, and DC arrangements. Luca sat very still through all of it. When Raphael finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Then Luca said, Did he ever have a moment where he could have just come to you? Could he have said, I'm scared of what's coming, I don't know where I fit. I need to know that I matter. Did he have that option? Raphael said, yes. Luca said, and he didn't take it. Raphael said, no. Luca stood up. He walked across the room and stood beside Raphael. He didn't say anything else. He just stood there. That was the whole of it. No speech, no declaration. Just a 32-year-old man crossing a room to stand beside the person who raised him. It was the most honest thing Raphael had seen in 8 months. Dante Caruso was not a stupid man. That was the thing about him that made the whole situation more complicated and more painful than a simple story about good and evil. He was smart, experienced, and in many ways genuinely capable. He had built real things alongside Raphael, had made real contributions, had been, for large stretches of 30 years, actually loyal. The loyalty had been real. It had just at some point been overtaken by something else. Fear is quiet. That's the part people don't talk about. The way fear works is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates, like sediment at the bottom of a river, until one day the current is different, and you don't entirely know when it changed. Dante had watched Raphael talk about stepping back for 3 years, not publicly, not in official meetings, but in those late conversations, the ones that happen after the formal business is done, and two people who have known each other for decades drop the professional distance. Raphael had started talking about the end of this chapter, about handing things off, about what came next. And every time the person Raphael talked about handing things off to was Luca. Not Dante. Luca. The man had spent 30 years learning this business, had made the calls that couldn't be undone, had stood in rooms where the decisions that were made were the kind that follow you, had given things that couldn't be given back. And the heir to all of it was going to be a man in his 30s who had grown up in a nice house and been handed opportunities and was, by most honest assessments, not yet fully formed. That was what Dante told himself, that the assessment was fair, that the indignation was justified, that something had to be done. People are very good at finding reasons for what they've already decided to do. Raphael called Dante into the study on a Thursday afternoon and asked him to close the door. Dante closed it, sat down across the desk, looked at the man he had known for 30 years, and did what smart people do when they realize the other person already knows. He went very still, and he waited. Raphael said, "How long?" Not a question. The tone of a man who already had the answer and was giving the other person a chance to speak it first. Dante said, 10 months. Raphael said, "Why?" And Dante told him. Not because he was breaking, not because he lost his nerve, but because the reason he had been telling himself for 10 months was the one thing he needed Raphael to hear. The fear, the 30 years, the sense of being left behind by someone he had helped build everything with. The certainty that what was coming was not fair, even if what he had done was worse. He said, "I wasn't trying to kill you. I want you to believe that." Raphael said, "You were trying to make me step back sooner, make me look too sick to lead so that when the handover happened, it happened on your timeline, with you in position." Dante said, "Yes." Raphael said, "And Edward Santos." The room changed. Dante said, "That was a different situation." Raphael said, "Tell me what situation it was." Dante said, "He found something in the books, something that, at the time, I decided was a risk we couldn't afford to carry. You were in the middle of the largest expansion you had ever attempted. The vulnerability window was narrow, and what he'd found could have collapsed it. I made a decision." Raphael said, "You made a decision?" Dante said, "Yes." Raphael said, "Without telling me." Dante said, "I was always making decisions without telling you. That was my job." Raphael said, "Your job was to advise me, not to act in my name without my knowledge." Dante said nothing. Raphael stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the garden, where the afternoon light was going orange through the oak tree. He stood there for a long time, not moving, not speaking, just standing. Then he said, "You've been making decisions in my name for 30 years. I know that. Some of them I sanctioned. Some of them I didn't know about and should have. Some of them were the right calls and some weren't. That's the nature of the relationship we built." He turned around. "But this, what you put in my house, in my bathroom, in my body for 10 months, and what you did to that man in 2009, those are not decisions you made on my behalf. Those are decisions you made for yourself, wrapped in language that made them sound like loyalty." Dante said, "I know." Raphael said, "Do you?" Dante said, "I think so. Now." Silence in the room. Then Raphael said, "Get up, go home, don't come back here, don't contact anyone in the organization. My lawyers will be in touch within the week." Dante stood. He looked at Raphael, this man he had known for 30 years, and there was something on his face that was not quite regret and not quite defiance. Something in between. Something that had no clean name. He walked out of the study. He walked down the stairs. He walked out of the house. Luca was standing in the hallway when Dante came past. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Dante drove away from the estate at 3:47 on a Thursday afternoon in November, and he did not come back. The lawyers came. The paperwork was completed. The specific terms of Dante's departure were documented in language that made clear, in language that would survive any legal challenge. What could happen if those terms were not honored? It was quiet. It was thorough. It was the kind of consequence that follows a man forever without making noise. It was also, Raphael had to acknowledge to himself, not justice for Edward Santos. That was a separate problem, and a harder one. The kind of thing that could not be resolved through lawyers and paperwork alone. The kind of thing that had a real person attached to it who deserved more than the efficient management of her grief. He thought about what Maria had told him. The photo, the strip of paper, the way she had described Edward, the evenings when he helped neighbors file their taxes because it made him feel useful. He knew what he needed to do next. After Dante left, the house became a different place. Not loudly, not in any way you could point at and name. But the quality of the air changed the way it changes after a storm passes, when the pressure finally settles and you realize how much tension you had been holding in your shoulders without knowing. Raphael spent the first week moving carefully. There were people in the organization who had grown accustomed to reaching Dante first. People who now needed to understand the new arrangement without being told too much about the old one. He handled those conversations the way he handled most hard conversations, directly, and without unnecessary explanation. Luca, for the first time, was given the full weight of what that kind of work felt like. One morning, sitting together in the study, Raphael asked him, "What did you feel when I told you about Dante?" Luca thought about it. He said, "I felt stupid, like I should have seen it and I didn't." Raphael said, "You weren't supposed to see it. He was very good at keeping you from seeing it." Luca said, "That doesn't make me feel much better." Raphael said, "Good. Feeling stupid is useful. It means you're paying attention now. The question is what you do with it." Luca said, "I want to be more careful about what I accept at face value." Raphael said, "Yes, but carefully. There is a difference between being careful and being paranoid. Paranoid people see threats everywhere and trust nothing and eventually make decisions based on fear. Careful people pay attention. They notice what doesn't fit. They say something when they notice it, even if they're not sure." Luca said, "I noticed things. I didn't say them." Raphael said, "That's the lesson." He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "There's a reason I'm telling you this. A reason beyond the situation with Dante. When I step back from this, which I intend to do on a timeline that makes sense for the organization and not one dictated by anyone's fear, I need to know that the person taking the lead has learned the hardest lesson of this work. Not the tactics, not the logistics, the people lesson." Luca said, "Which is?" Raphael said, "That the most dangerous person in your world is not your enemy." It's the person close to you who stops talking to you honestly and starts managing you instead. If you can keep the people around you honest, and more importantly, if you can stay honest yourself when honest is hard, you'll be all right. Luca sat with that for a long time. Then he said, "How do you keep people honest?" Raphael said, "By being the kind of person they feel safe being honest with." That's a whole other conversation, and it'll take longer than this morning, but that's the answer. They sat in the study together, the older man and the younger, with the November light coming in sideways through the windows, and the house quiet around them, and the question of what came next sitting between them like something they were still building. The independent investigation into Edward Santos took 4 weeks. Raphael had hired someone external, a private investigator he had used before for sensitive matters, a woman named Claudia, who asked good questions and made no assumptions, and delivered reports that said exactly what the evidence supported and nothing more. The report came back on a Monday in December. The accident on the highway in 2009 had not been caused by driver error. The physical evidence, some of which had been preserved in the original insurance documentation and some of which Claudia had tracked through secondary sources, was consistent with deliberate interference with the vehicle's steering system. The interference had been subtle, the kind that would have been easy to classify as mechanical failure in a routine investigation. The case could not be prosecuted. The primary person responsible was beyond the reach of the legal system in any practical sense. The statute of limitations on certain aspects had expired. What remained was not nothing, but it was not enough for a courtroom. What it was the truth. Raphael put the report in an envelope. He wrote Maria's name on the outside. He set it on the kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning when he knew she would be there. He didn't add a note. He thought about it. He decided that the report itself said enough. He went to his study. He heard her arrive at 6:20. He heard her stop in the kitchen, heard the silence that meant she had picked up the envelope, heard her go quiet for longer than usual. Then he heard her go on with her morning. That afternoon, he called Dr. Walsh with one last question. He said, "How long before the compound fully clears my system?" She said, "You're already showing significant improvement. Another 2 to 3 weeks and you should be back to baseline. There may be some residual fatigue, but I expect a full recovery." He said, "Good." She said, "Raphael, for what it's worth, I spent 8 months treating symptoms that didn't make sense, and I want you to know that I've thought about that, whether there was something I should have caught sooner." He said, "There wasn't. You were looking for what was there to be found. Nobody told you to look for what was being hidden." She said, "That's a generous reading." He said, "It's an accurate one. Thank you, Patricia, for everything." He hung up. He sat for a moment in the quiet of his study. 30 years. A lot of things had happened in 30 years. He was not a man who wasted time cataloging regret, but there was something in the reckoning of these past weeks that had asked him to look at things he had been moving past too quickly for too long. The people in this house, the people who worked in the spaces around him, invisible by convention if not by choice, the architecture of his attention, where it went and where it didn't. He had built a lot. He had protected a lot. He had, along the way, stopped looking at certain things as carefully as they deserved. That, at least, he could change. The week before Thanksgiving, Raphael woke up at 5:30, same as always, and went downstairs without thinking about whether he could. He stood in the kitchen and made coffee. His hand was steady, his mind was clear. The fatigue that had been sitting on him for 8 months was still there at the edges, thinning out, receding like a tide going out, but the difference from a month ago was already significant. Rosa came in at 7 and stopped in the doorway. She said, "You made coffee." He said, "I did." She said, "You haven't made coffee in a long time." He said, "I know." She looked at him for a moment. This woman who had fed him for 20 years and worried over his appetite and watched his illness with the helpless concern of someone who loves a person but can't reach the thing that's hurting them. Then she went to the refrigerator and started pulling things out. He said, "What are you making?" She said, "Breakfast, a real one. Sit down." He sat down. He ate everything on the plate. On a Tuesday morning, he was in his study when Maria came in to clean. This was unremarkable. She had done this 5 mornings a week for 12 years. But this time, instead of letting the routine carry them both, he said, "Maria, do you have a few minutes?" She said, "Of course, sir." She set down her supply caddy. She was looking at him with the expression she often wore when she wasn't sure what a situation was going to require of her, prepared but not preemptive. He said, "Come sit down." She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from the desk. He noticed, not for the first time, but perhaps for the first time with full attention, that she sat very straight. She always sat very straight. It was the posture of someone who had decided that the way you hold yourself says something about who you are and had made a deliberate choice about what to say. He said, "I want to tell you what Claudia found. About Edward." Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He told her. Everything in the report, the physical evidence, the conclusion, the reasons it couldn't go to prosecution. He told her clearly and without softening it, because he judged that she deserved clarity more than comfort. When he finished, she sat for a moment with it. Then she said, "He didn't lose control of the car." Raphael said, "No," she said. "He did everything right." Raphael said, "Yes." She looked down at her hands in her lap. Then she looked back up. She said, "He would have been glad to know that. He was always very particular about his driving. He would have wanted the record to be right." Raphael said, "The record is right now." She said, "Thank you." He said, "I owe you more than that, a great deal more than that." She said, "You don't owe me anything, sir. I did what was right. That's not the kind of thing you owe someone for." He looked at her. He said, "How long have you been working here?" She said, 12 years. He said, 12 years. "And in that time, how often do you think I actually looked at you? Not at the work. At you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Not often, sir." He said, "Not at all. I'll be more accurate. I looked at what you did. I didn't look at who you were doing it. And I let that go for 12 years because everyone around me treated it as normal." She said, "It is normal, sir, in places like this." He said, "Yes, that's the problem." She didn't say anything to that. She let it sit. She had a quality he had noticed before, the quality of knowing when something didn't require a response, when the space between sentences was doing its own work. He said, "I want you to know something. What you did, coming to me with what you found, taking the risk you took, not knowing how I would receive it. That is not a small thing. That is not something I will forget." She said, "I was frightened." He said, "I know. That's what made it brave." She looked at him with an expression that was very still and very clear. Not moved, not unmoved, just present in the way that certain people are present, fully, without reservation. She said, "What happens now, with the organization, with Luca, with all of it?" He said, "That's a longer answer. But the short version is that things will be different. Better in some ways, more honest in some ways, which often means harder in some ways, but more honest." She said, "Luca will be all right." He said, "You think so?" She said, "I've watched him grow up in this house, sir. He has good instincts. He just needed permission to trust them." Raphael said, "Yes, that's exactly it." There was a quiet between them. Not the quiet of people with nothing to say, the quiet of people who have said the important things and are letting them settle. Then she stood up, smoothed her apron, and picked up her supply caddy. She said, "Is there anything else you need?" He said, "No, thank you, Maria." She nodded. She went back to her work. And Raphael sat in his study for a long time afterward, thinking about the particular quality of someone who does the right thing in the dark, with no audience, with no guarantee of outcome, not because it is convenient or rewarded, but simply because it is right. How rare that was. how completely he had taken it for granted. He picked up his pen and got back to work. December came to Boston with its usual lack of ceremony. Cold, gray, the kind of flat light that shortens the days and makes everything feel like it's being done under a dimmer switch. But in the estate on the outskirts of the city, something had changed in the texture of the place that had nothing to do with the weather. It was quieter, but not the quiet of absence, the quiet that had settled into the house in those 8 months when everyone moved carefully around a man who was diminishing. This was a different quiet, the quiet of a house that has been through something and is finding its footing again. Raphael was at full capacity now. Dr. Walsh had confirmed it in the first week of December. His blood work was clean. His hand was steady. He had run a full meeting 2 days in a row without losing a thread, without needing to pause to let his mind catch up, without any of the small failures that had become so normalized that no one remarked on them anymore. Luca noticed. He noticed in the way that someone notices when a sound they had stopped hearing, the drip in the ceiling, the rattle of the old pipes, goes away, and the silence in its place is a different kind of thing. One morning, walking past the study, Luca heard Raphael on the phone. The voice was sharp, decisive, 2 sentences and done. The voice of a man who knows what he wants and sees no reason to spend extra words on it. Luca stopped in the hallway and just listened for a moment. Then he went to his office and sat down and made some decisions of his own that had been waiting for his confidence to catch up. On a Friday morning, Rosa made the breakfast she had made the previous Tuesday, the full one, the real one. She made it because Raphael had asked her to, and because asking for food was, in her understanding, the most reliable indicator of a person's actual state of health. He ate everything again. She said, "You're back." He said, "I am." She said, "Good, you were worrying me." He said, "I know, I'm sorry about that." She said, "You don't apologize to me, Raphael, just don't do it again." He said, "I'll do my best." She waved him off and turned back to the stove, and that was the full extent of the emotional conversation they needed to have. Maria came in at 6:20 on the last Friday before Christmas. She went through her rounds. Kitchen first, then the main rooms, then the upstairs. At 2:30 she was finishing up in the study when Raphael came back from a meeting and found her there. He said, "Almost done?" She said, "10 minutes." He sat down on the corner sofa, not at the desk. The sofa. He looked like a man who had decided he had earned the right to sit somewhere comfortable. She kept working. After a few minutes, he said, "Maria, what are your plans for Christmas?" She said, "I'll go to my sister's in Providence, just a few days." He said, "Good, you should take the full week." She stopped what she was doing. "Sir, I have the 23rd and 24th off, and then I come back on the 27th, that's the arrangement." He said, "The arrangement is changing. Take the full week. Come back on January 2nd. She looked at him. He was looking at the window, the garden outside, the oak tree bare now against the white December sky. She said, "Thank you." He said, "It's your vacation. It has nothing to do with thanks." She smiled at that, very small, the kind of smile that happens before you can stop it. She finished the study. She gathered her things. She put on her coat. She was almost to the door when he said, without turning from the window, "Maria." She said, "Sir?" He said, "I've been thinking about something. I've been thinking about the fact that you spent 12 years in this house doing your job every day, noticing things that needed noticing, being a decent and honest presence in a place that doesn't always have a lot of those. And nobody, including me, thought to ask what it actually meant to you, whether this was the life you wanted or the life you'd found yourself in." She stood in the doorway. She said, "It's both. Most lives are both." He said, "That's true." She said, "Are you asking me something specific?" He said, "I'm asking if you're all right. Not about the situation with Dante, not about Edward, not about any of it in particular, just, are you all right?" She thought about it. She looked at the room. This room she had cleaned 5 mornings a week for 12 years, the worn oak floor, the books on the shelves, the marks of 30 years of a life being lived in here. She thought about Edward, the way she always thought about Edward, like a note playing at the back of a song, always there, not always in the foreground. She said, "Yes, I think so. More than I've been in a long time, actually." He said, "Good." She said, "Are you?" He turned from the window and looked at her. Something in his expression was new, or not new exactly, more like something that had always been there, was now visible in a way it hadn't been before. The warmth he usually kept wrapped so tight you only caught glimpses of it. He said, "More than I've been in a long time." She said, "I'll see you on January 2nd, sir." He said, "Happy Christmas, Maria." She said, "Happy Christmas." She walked down the hallway and down the stairs and out through the side entrance, and she pulled her coat closer against the December cold, and she got in her car. She sat there for a moment before she started the engine. She was thinking about something a priest had said at Edward's funeral 15 years ago, a line she had not understood at the time and had not stopped thinking about since. He had said that grief is just love with nowhere to go. And she had thought, for 15 years, yes, exactly, that is what this is. But lately she had started to think that wasn't the whole of it. That love is stubborn and resourceful and finds ways to go somewhere, even when the obvious place is gone. It goes into work, into small daily acts of care, into the particular attention you bring to a room you are responsible for, into the willingness to tell the truth to a dangerous man in a garden because the truth matters more than your fear. She started the car. The drive home took 20 minutes. She stopped at the corner store and bought bread and tomatoes and the ingredients for a real dinner. She came home and cooked with music on, something she hadn't done in a long time. She ate at the kitchen table with Edward's photo on the shelf and the winter dark outside the window, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 3 months later, in March, something small happened that the people who study cause and effect would have found interesting. Luca was in a meeting with 2 associates and a third party he had been asked to evaluate. Halfway through the meeting, one of the associates said something that didn't quite fit. Not wrong, exactly. Just slightly off. The way a color can be almost the right shade, but not quite. Luca noticed it. A year ago, he would have filed it away and waited to see if it resolved itself. Instead, he stopped the meeting. He said, "I want to come back to something you said a few minutes ago. Can you walk me through the details on that again?" The associate did. The details, looked at carefully, contained a problem. Not a catastrophic one, but the kind that becomes catastrophic if left alone. They handled it that afternoon. Later, Luca told Raphael what had happened. Raphael listened. Then he said, "How did it feel?" Luca said, "Strange. A little uncomfortable." Raphael said, "That feeling goes away." Luca said, "Is that a good thing?" Raphael said, "Yes and no. What you want to keep is the habit, the willingness to stop and ask. The discomfort is just the unfamiliarity. Once the habit is built, you'll do it without the discomfort. But you have to get through the discomfort first to build the habit." Luca said, "How long does that take?" Raphael said, "How long did it take to stop noticing the sound of Maria's car in the morning?" Luca thought about it. He said, "I don't remember when I stopped noticing." Raphael said, "Exactly." On a Tuesday in April, Maria was cleaning the study and she found, on Raphael's desk, next to the lamp, a small framed photograph she had never seen before. It was a photo of a man she didn't recognize, older, probably in his 50s, standing in front of what looked like a Sicilian street. He was laughing at something, head back, the full kind of laugh. She studied it for a moment. She had never seen any personal photographs in this room before. In 12 years, not one. She dusted around the frame carefully. She moved on. That evening, driving home, she thought about it. About what it meant to finally let a room show you who you were, to put a picture on the desk instead of keeping it in a drawer, to let even small things take up visible space. She thought it meant something. She didn't know exactly what, but it meant something. The last scene in this story happens on a morning in late April, when the garden finally comes back to life after the long Boston winter. The oak tree at the far end of the lawn has new leaves. The flower beds Maria tends have started to bloom, the ones she planted replacements for after the November cold killed the last batch. Raphael is in the garden with his coffee, not sitting, standing, looking at the oak tree. Maria comes out to water the new beds. They don't say much. There isn't much to say that hasn't already been said. But at one point, Raphael says, "How is your sister?" She says, "Good. Her granddaughter just started walking." He says, "That's a good age." She says, "It is." She keeps watering. He keeps standing with his coffee. After a while, he says, "You know what I've been thinking about?" She says, "What?" He says, "My father used to say that the real test of a person is what they do when no one is looking." He meant it as a warning, but I've started thinking about it differently. I think the real test is what you do when no one is looking, and there is no benefit to doing the right thing, when it costs something, when you could just look away and nothing would happen to you if you did. He pauses. He says, "That's a different standard. Most people don't clear it." She says quietly, "Most people don't get tested that way." He looks at her. He says, "You did." She says, "Yes." He says, "And you didn't look away." She says, "No." They stand in the garden with that between them for a moment. The light is good. The tree is green. Somewhere a bird is doing what birds do in April, making noise about it being spring. Then Maria says, "I'm going to finish the east bed before lunch." He says, "Take your time." She moves to the east bed. He finishes his coffee. The house is quiet around them. The kind of quiet that is not empty. The kind that has people in it. There is one more thing. In the drawer of Raphael's desk, underneath a set of import reports and 2 draft contracts, there is a small piece of folded paper. Very old. The handwriting is in Italian, from when he was 15 years old, a promise he made to himself after his father died. It says, in the translation he never did out loud, but always knew by heart, "I will not let anyone take from me what I have built." Underneath that line, in newer ink, in English, in his current handwriting, are 10 words he added sometime in December. "What you build means nothing if you build it alone." He doesn't look at the paper often. He doesn't need to. It's in the drawer because some things belong in the drawer, not on display, carried privately, the way you carry the most important things. But it's there, and the words are true. Here is what this story is really about. It is not about the poison in the capsule, though that is real. It is not about the betrayal of 30 years of friendship, though that is real too. It is about the fact that the most powerful man in every room he walked into, a man who had spent decades building walls and managing access and controlling information and trusting no one fully, was seen. Finally, actually, completely seen. Not by a lawyer or a doctor or a fellow professional, by the woman who came to clean his house, because she was the one who looked. We spend a lot of time and effort trying to be seen by the right people, the impressive ones, the powerful ones, the ones whose attention feels like validation. And in doing so, we are often blind to the person right next to us who is already paying attention, who has been paying attention for years. Maria Santos was not a hero in any conventional sense of the word. She had no protection and no guarantee and no way of knowing how this would go when she walked out to that garden with a watering can. She just had 12 years of noticing and enough courage to do something with it. She had the courage to look, and then the courage to speak. Those 2 things are available to all of us, every day. The question is whether we use them. This work of fiction is a product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events, or locales is purely coincidental. The narrative is intended solely for artistic and entertainment purposes, and should not be interpreted as a reflection of real individuals or factual occurrences.
Before we go, I want to sit with you for just a moment, because this story is not really about poison. It is not really about a mafia boss, or a cleaning lady, or a man who betrayed 30 years of friendship for the chance to hold on to something that was never fully his to begin with. This story is about something much quieter than all of that, and much harder. It is about who we choose to see. Rafael Moro spent 30 years building an empire. He was sharp, he was careful, he controlled every room he walked into. And yet the most important thing happening inside his own house, happening to his own body, was visible only to the woman he had looked past for 12 years. Not because she was exceptional, not because she had special training or special access, simply because she paid attention when everyone else had stopped. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful man in the room was saved not by his lawyers, not by his doctor, not by the loyal son who loved him. He was saved by the person nobody thought to look at. The person who showed up at 6:20 every morning, did her work, and went home at 3. The person whose name he had spoken out loud exactly twice in 12 years. We do this. All of us do this. We look past the people who are most consistently present in our lives because consistency stops feeling like something we need to pay attention to. We notice the new. We notice the impressive. We notice the people whose attention we want to earn, and in doing so, we become blind to the ones who are already giving us theirs. The first lesson in this story is simply this. Look at the people around you, not at what they do for you, at who they are. The person who has shown up reliably, quietly, without drama, without demanding recognition, that person is worth more of your attention than you are probably giving them. The second lesson belongs to Maria. She was afraid. She had every reason to walk away. She had no guarantee of how Raphael would receive what she knew. She had no protection, no backup plan, nothing but the truth and the decision to say it out loud. And she said it anyway, not because she was fearless, because she understood that fear is not a reason to stay silent. Fear is just the feeling you breathe through on the way to doing what needs to be done. And the third lesson is the one Raphael wrote down for himself, alone, in December, in a drawer where no one would see it. 10 words that changed the whole shape of how he understood his life. What you build means nothing if you build it alone. Power without trust is just control. Control without honesty is just a slower way to fall. And the life that only looks impressive from the outside is not a life that can hold. The real thing, the thing worth building, is made of people who tell you the truth, who show up, who look at you when no one told them to. If you have someone like that in your life, you already know who they are. Go tell them you see them. That is the whole of it.